Good afternoon, good evening around the world. Thank you very much for joining us to launch Global Prison Trends 2020. This is our flagship annual publication at Penal Reform International, which we do with the Thailand Justice. And today we have a quite exceptional and high-level panel to launch this Global Prison Trends in a time of crisis when the coronavirus is knocking at the doors of prisons around the world. My name is Florian Eminger. I'm the Executive Director of Penal Reform International, and thank you again for joining us. I would like to start this session with outlining a few ground rules. First of all, guest speakers can be seen and can be heard. Unfortunately, with around 500 people connected, it is impossible for us to have 500 people seen and heard at the same time, and I would be absolutely incompetent in moderating 500 people who want to ask questions. Hence, all questions are welcome through Twitter if you use the hashtag Global Prison Trends in one word, and we will do our best to bring these questions to the panelists at the end of their presentations. We'll have a questions and answers moment. So if you use the hashtag Global Prison Trends, we'll be able to track your questions and bring them forward. Another reminder is that this webinar is being recorded and will be made available, I'm guessing, on PRI's YouTube channel. I just mentioned that coronavirus is knocking on the doors of prisons globally. We have seen disasters in prisons around the world, prison lockdown and quarantines of people in prisons. We have seen riots of prisoners afraid of being forgotten that led even to death. We have seen in some countries the development of detention regimes in individual cells that in many ways amount to solitary confinement. We have seen death of people with underlying health issues who were in detention. We have seen people infected due to miserable health conditions. We have also seen court proceedings being put on hold and suspects waiting on pretrial detention. Whilst so many countries, we are standing on our windows and on our balconies to applaud essential staff and health staff around the world. We are, though, sending prison staff to work in places with particularly pure hygiene, with minimum protection, minimum information or education on how health measures can protect themselves and protect other people in prison. Yet, on the positive side, we have seen what we would have never expected before at such a fast pace, meaning reduction of sentences, early releases, conditional releases, amnesty. And in total, this is difficult to monitor right now, but in total it looks like 200,000 people were released from places of detention within less than a month. So at a very fast pace. At the same time, pretrial detention is used less. We have seen execution of sentences, especially short sentences, being postponed around the globe. And in many, many countries, prisons massively invested into sanitizing products, into healthcare and water to be brought to prisons that were lacking it before. And in quite a few prisons, we have also witnessed that contact with relatives and legal counsel has been made easier thanks to online and telephone contacts. So as we are looking at the developments within a month with coronavirus, we should, though, keep in mind what Penal Reform International and others have been saying for so long, that is that coronavirus is not the crisis in itself. It sheds the light on the crisis in which criminal justice systems were, and on really the poverty of the detention conditions globally for so many people who are kept on detention. When we say so many, it is 11 million, as you will hear more from other speakers. Without further delay, I would really like to, again, welcome you to ask questions with the hashtag Global Prison Trends. And I will now give the floor to one of our two introductory speakers, a person I personally admire, who has been a member of the Human Rights Committee at the United Nations, and is now the United Nations Assistant Secretary General for Human Rights, Ilse Brandt-Keris, and part of the leadership of an office at the United Nations, the Human Rights, the High Commissioner's Office for Human Rights that we all cherish. Ilse, the floor is yours.
I really want to thank you for the opportunity to speak at the launch of the Global Prison Trends 2020, was jointly published by the Penal Reform International and Thailand Institute of Justice. This year, the report arrives at a crucial juncture. We just heard many inputs into this, when millions of people around the world are living through extremely difficult times because of the rapid global spread of COVID-19. All our efforts should focus on slowing down this spread and ensuring that all persons, irrespective of their citizenship, migratory, social, economic, or other status, and in particular the most vulnerable, receive the protection and care they're entitled to. States are responding with broad and sometimes unprecedented measures to safeguard the health and well-being of their populations. However, even in the context of public emergency, all steps taken must be based on the rule of law. During these trying times, efforts need to redouble to deliver fair, effective, and human rights compliant criminal justice processes and outcomes. Many courts around the world have temporarily limited the range of matters that can be brought before them during the pandemic. However, states remain legally bound to provide effective remedies to victims of human rights violations, including persons whose rights have been improperly limited through emergency measures designed to combat the pandemic. Persons in detention are entitled to have their detention reviewed by court of law, including during emergency situations, and procedural guarantees such as the right to have access to a court to challenge deprivation of liberty and the right of persons deprived of liberty to be brought promptly before a judge must continue to be respected. The COVID crisis occurs in the context of a long-standing general crisis of the prison situation in the world, now exacerbated by the current public health emergency. As a report launched today sets out, 11 million people are currently imprisoned globally, the highest number ever recorded. A large number of those behind bars are awaiting trial, and some of them have been in pre-trial detention for years. Many are detained in poor conditions in overcrowded prisons and detention centers. 102 countries have reported prison occupancy levels of over 110%. Many detainees are suffering from serious diseases due to the lack of clean drinking water, proper ventilation, and other factors due to the failure to uphold minimum standards for detention conditions. This situation poses particularly acute risks in case of an uncontrollable coronavirus outbreak, and this poses unprecedented threats to the lives of detainees. From the onset of the crisis, our office has been deeply concerned over the impact that the spread of COVID-19 is likely to have on persons deprived of their liberty. The High Commissioner has called on states to examine ways to release those especially vulnerable to the virus, older persons, the sick, as well as low-risk offenders, and that now is the time more than ever to release those detained without sufficient legal basis, including political prisoners and those detained for critical dissenting views. Always, but especially now, all those detained arbitrarily should be released and alternatives to detention should be prioritized. A growing number of countries have taken measures to release prisoners. We just heard an encouraging number in the introduction. Some serve indeed as good practice examples. However, there are also examples where this practice has led to additional human rights concerns. In the case where release of prisoners who are convicted for serious human rights violations, or even war crimes, is done, and also where large-scale releases are done except for dissenters and political prisoners. This is a misuse of the urgent need to decongest prisons. Together with the World Health Organization, we have also co-drafted a document issued by the UN Interagency Standing Committee on 20th of March, aiming at addressing the specific issues of persons deprived of their liberty with the responsible services and ministries at the national level. Our office has been engaging with national authorities to recall, first of all, the need to comply with international norms and standards regarding the legality, necessity, and proportionality of imprisonment, the legal basis for detention, no prosecution for crimes not consistent with human rights law, and reduction of the over-reliance of pretrial detention. Recourse to alternatives to imprisonment must be increased, including replacing detention with non-custodial measures at the sentencing stage. States should also consider implementing schemes of early, provisional, or temporary release for those detainees for whom it is safe to do so, taking full account of non-custodial measures as provided for in the UN Standard Minimum Rules on Non-Custodial Measures, the Tokyo Rules, and we should reinforce our advocacy for the implementation of the UN rules for the treatment of women prisoners and non-custodial measures for women offenders, also known as the Bangkok rules. My last point addresses measures which national authorities should take to protect the lives and health of persons who remain in detention, including during pandemics and public health emergencies. States have a duty to ensure the health care of people in prisons and other places of detention. The Nelson Mandela rules recall that persons in detention should have access to the same standard of health care as is available in the community. This obligation applies to all detainees, regardless of their status, but particular attention should be devoted to those who may have special needs, including women, older detainees, persons with disabilities, and juveniles. The current context underscores that maintaining health in prisons and other detention centers is in the interest of persons deprived of their liberty, but also the staff of the facility and the community at large. We have seen in many countries the disproportionate impact of the pandemic on those already living in the margins of society, those in most vulnerable situations, those most discriminated against. Those deprived of their liberty are no exception. If anything, this pandemic has clearly demonstrated the urgent need to institutional reforms and societal transformation, where human rights must be front and center of both our immediate response and in guiding the way forward. It is time for ensuring the long-term view, addressing systemic problems, as well as the adoption of immediate health and life-saving measures. This also applies to our criminal justice and penal systems. Ensuring respect for human rights and human dignity only makes those stronger. The report you're releasing today is an important contribution to this effort. I look forward to continued collaboration with PRI and TJI as we strive to build fair and effective criminal justice systems that strengthen respect for human rights, reinforce the rule of law, and achieve the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam Assistant Secretary General, and thanks so much to your office with WHO for its leadership in addressing the rights of people in detention around the globe at this stage. It has really been highly appreciated. I understand that you will at some point need to join another event hosted by our friends from the Universal Rights Group. So we'll let you leave discreetly whenever that is, but thank you for opening our event. Our second introductory speaker is from a good friend of PRI, the Thailand Institute of Justice. I want to give you, without any further delay, Dr. Kittipong, the floor to introduce the global prison trends. We have now published 4 editions together, and it is always a pleasure to be working with the Thailand Institute of Justice and to be launching this annual publication with you. Floor is yours, Dr. Kittipong.
It is my great pleasure and honor to be here with all of you virtually to launch this Global Prison Trend Report 2020, our annual publication in partnership with Penal Reform International. Every year, this report aims to provide a comprehensive overview of current trends, new developments, and challenges in the criminal justice system around the world. And normally, this launch takes place in person, but as we know, the word normal now no longer exists. The world around us is in crisis with the sudden emergence of the coronavirus pandemic. And this crisis has left certain sections of society deeply vulnerable. Some of the most at-risk populations right now are those in prison, particularly elderly prisoners, pregnant women, children residing in prison with their mothers, and those with illnesses and underlying health conditions. Long before the COVID-19 outbreak, most prisons were already struggling with the overcrowding problem. With congested and under-resourced prisons, this pandemic can have catastrophic consequences for prisoners, prison staff, and wider society. To counter this, many countries have started releasing prisoners and adopting alternatives to imprisonment. However, these changes are reactionary in nature and will not lead to sustained changes unless we take proactive action. The Global Prison Trends report this year aims to contribute to this conversation. In addition to highlighting timely issues related to excessive pretrial detention and inadequate healthcare in prisons, the special focus section on alternatives to imprisonment emphasized the urgent need to create robust mechanisms to implement non-custodial measures at all stages of the criminal justice system. In Southeast Asia, the region where we work, most penal systems are severely overcrowded, primarily due to the punitive drug policies. As a result, there has been a lack of adequate resources, including medicine, healthcare services, and medical personnel. In the context of Thailand, TIJ recently published the report on the COVID-19 situation in prisons and policy recommendations for national stakeholders, which, among other things, promote the use of alternatives to imprisonment as an immediate response to the COVID-19 outbreak and a long-term solution for effective criminal justice system. Moreover, together with UNODC, TIJ has recently launched the National Toolkit on Gender-Responsive Non-Custodial Measures to promote alternatives to incarceration for women offenders who tend to commit non-serious offenses. The toolkit takes into account women's pathways to prison, their gender-specific needs, and the harmful impacts of imprisonment on women and their families. The world has post this pandemic, after this pandemic, will undoubtedly look very different from it is now. COVID-19 is affecting people's behavior and crime pattern and accelerating change and innovation at every stage of the criminal justice system. This is our opportunity, I believe, to push for reformative approach to crime prevention and criminal justice and redefine the notion of punishment. Through our work and collaboration with like-minded organizations around the world, we hope to see prison being used as a measure of last resort and for the shortest period of time. This launch event is a small step to take this conversation forward. And I'm very hopeful that tangible moves toward criminal justice reforms will emerge as a result of the current crisis. Last but not least, I would like to thank each and every one of you for your time. I do hope that you will find the report presented today to be a useful resource. Finally, I would like to express my sincere appreciation to our partner PRI for the strong partnership and dedication in promoting fair and effective criminal justice system worldwide. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kittipong, and for sure, to be able to build long-term reform, we will all be needing the leadership of the Thai Institute for Justice, and our friendship is one little stone in that, and we hope to have a long-standing change in the years to come. Before giving the floor to our five speakers, let me remind you that you can put questions through on Twitter with the hashtag Global Prison Trends, and you can address questions to any of the panelists, and including Dr. Kitty Pong, who will also be with us for the Q&A after the presentations. We will now dive into a number of different issues, starting with the presentation of the actual publication of Global Prison Trends 2020 by Olivia Rope from Penal Reform International. We will then dive more in depth into the health risks associated with coronavirus in prisons with Dr. Karina Ferrer-Borges from the World Health Organization. We will speak more about alternatives and non-custodial measures with Joel Hernandez Garcia, who is the president of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. We will be speaking about the risks associated with long sentences and lifelong sentences with Professor Dirk van Zyl-Smit from the University of Nottingham. And we will end the presentations before the Q&A with Sarah Bellal speaking about safety and security in detention. She is from the Justice Project Pakistan. I will then start by giving the floor to my colleague, Olivia Rope, PRI's Director of Policy and International Advocacy, who will basically present the new Global Prison Trends.
I will try in the limited time. Thank you, Florian. And welcome to all of my fellow panelists and everybody who's on this webinar today. It's really a pleasure to be presenting our brand new report published this morning, Global Prison Trends 2020. I want to start by echoing what the Assistant Secretary General and Dr. Kitty Pong mentioned around, there's no doubt that prisons and justice systems are facing an overwhelming crisis today with coronavirus. And only with, bold, coordinated international action do we think there is a chance to mitigate, not prevent, but mitigate the damage of this virus in prisons. However, as has been mentioned, COVID-19 has really just lit the fuse on the ticking time bomb that is present in our criminal justice systems. So for instance, today in our report, you will read that rates of deaths in prisons are at crisis levels. The mortality rate for people in custody is as much as 50% higher than for people outside. And this means that your life is literally at greater risk when detained. Violence in places of detention is on the increase, with crisis responses triggering the use of riot squads, for example, which often turn out to be fatal. Or conversely, the authorities' blindness to systematic violence, to torture, ill treatment, which is a human rights crisis, and we document this in some detail in our report. And lastly, as mentioned, this simply, crisis levels of overcrowding, as the Assistant Secretary General stated, prisons in over 100 countries operate above occupancy level, above their occupancy rates, and 22 operate above 200% of occupancy rates. So the spread of COVID-19 in such facilities is in effect a death sentence, and we have already seen some cases of this occurring already. I think the concerning thing with these crises that I've mentioned, alongside many others that we have documented, is that they have somewhat become the norm. They are the new normal, let's say. And in sharing, some of these key findings today from our report, I think we need to reflect on why and how prisons have got to this point. And I will do this hopefully sharing some slides that everybody can see to help us along. Bear with me. So of the 11 million people in prison globally, as mentioned, the majority are male adults. They usually make up 80% of convictions and 90% of those held in custody. And young male adults represent a significant proportion. We also see that the number of women although a minority, continues to rise in prison populations, with the global female prison population doubling over a 20-year time span. And while there have been some moves, thanks to the Bangkok rules, to improve conditions for women, our assessment in the report is that generally data and knowledge remains inadequate, and as does action to address the violence, poverty, and discrimination that's threaded through the stories of many of these women. For arguably the most vulnerable of all those detained children, the UN Global Study estimated at least 410,000 children are detained every year in prisons, and a further 1 million are held in police custody. These are very bleak numbers, and they show that, you know, while we have seen that some countries have successfully pursued child justice systems, the principle of using detention as a last resort for children is not yet a reality. Many are charged for offences that would not apply to adults, such as truancy or underage drinking. Pre-trial detention is too often the norm, not the exception. Over 3 million people await trials in jails, and 46 countries hold more people on remand assumed innocent than those convicted. And this shows really there's been very little progress towards lowering the proportion of pre-trial detainees as set out in the indicator for Goal 16 of the SDGs. In fact, the recent data issued by World Prison Brief shows the exact opposite. Over the past 20 years, the number of pre-trial detainees has grown by over 30%, which is faster than the growth in the general prison population. Our report also looks at, you know, the types of offences for people in prison, and it's clear that more costly and less effective prison sentences are also increasingly used for non-violent offences. So an estimated 50% or more of people that are sitting in prisons are there for non-violent offences. And analysis shows that prison is used as an automatic response to more and more crimes, and sentences are becoming longer, as will be discussed later. One of the starkest examples of this is with prohibition-based drug policies. Over 2 million people are in prison for drug offences, but the more telling statistic is that of those 2 million, 83% are there for drug possession for personal use. So we're seeing that countries that pursue harsh drug policies that target users and small-scale dealers or traffickers are not progressing to their proclaimed goal of achieving a drug-free world. Instead, they're targeting and sweeping up the poorest, the most vulnerable members of our society and marginalising them further. Our report this year also looks at how and why imprisonment continues to be a discriminatory cycle that is very difficult to break. Many countries report reoffending rates of above 50% among people released from their prisons. And the statistics rise even higher once post-release support wanes, so as the years kind of go on. Reducing recidivism is complex business, but there are some positives that we document in terms of the types of rehabilitation that's offered. For instance, our report looks at the promotion of sport from being a time killer for people in prison to an inherent aspect of crime prevention and rehabilitation. We also document how rehabilitation programs are increasingly designed to benefit wider society, with innovative projects popping up having sustainability, wildlife, and climate as the focus. This year, and this very much comes into light with the coronavirus pandemic, we've delved deeper into one of the core issues of many challenges, and that is funding. Whilst it was difficult to quantify the amount of money spent on prisons at a global level, not least because of transparency issues, there was some data available which allowed a comparative view across 54 countries. And our analysis found that, with a few exceptions, penitentiary systems generally receive low levels of funding, which is a grave indicator of lack of investment in creating effective justice systems. Government expenditure shows that across 54 countries, spending on prisons usually amounts to less than 0.3% of their GDP. There are huge variants in the amounts allocated per person per day in prison, as you can see on this map. And that's even if you take relative living costs. Staff and infrastructure appear to be the main cost for prisons, whereas food allocation is alarmingly low in some countries, totaling less than €1 per day per person. We see that where funding for prisons is increased, mostly these funds are earmarked to build or expand prison estates to contain growing populations. And one of the most serious impacts of under-resourcing that we document in our report is to do with prison healthcare. Prison healthcare has been dangerously inadequate in many countries and for many years. And this results in an acute shortage of healthcare staff. One example in our report shows in one African country, there are as few as 2 doctors for 46 prisons holding some 15,000 people. And while not as extreme, in Europe too, there is evidence of shortages of prison healthcare staff, as in other mid to high income countries. So even before COVID-19, this was a problem, but with coronavirus, we see a lack of equipment provision, and even on a basic level, let alone enough healthcare staff to advise prison administrations and assess risk or respond to cases. So where to next? Well, first, I think it's important to remember that behind all of our data and behind all of the statistics are people. We're at a point where never before have there been this many people in prison. And as our report shows, there is some positive work going on in some corners, but generally there is a need to rethink prisons, the use of them and the implementation of sentences. Prisons are simply targeting the marginalized, holding people back and causing human rights violations daily. So whilst immediate steps, as we have been discussing, are our focus, as we face the consequences of coronavirus, we need to think about the crisis that has existed for a long time. And in the special focus chapter this year, we do look at imprisonment alternatives as a solution to this. So the release of prisoners and the use of alternatives we have seen to dramatically reduce prison populations are unprecedented measures in unprecedented times, but these should not be temporary. And we need to move towards a system that can provide safe and rehabilitative focused prisons, which is simply impossible when they're bursting at the seams. I'm out of time, so I will leave it there, but I hope that our report is useful in focusing direction around reforms in the short and long term.
Thank you very much, Olivia, for giving such a overview of global prison trends in, well, close to 11 minutes. Thank you, to the team that has worked with you, to the team of the Thailand Institute of Justice that has been leading research, fact-finding and drafting this report. And thanks also to many colleagues out there that have been consulted, that contributed to the various sections. Global Prison Trends is really a kind of common project that we have with many, many partners. And so thanks to all of you, and congratulations to those of you that have been so closely involved in drafting it. Olivia just said so, healthcare in places of detention is a major concern for PRI. Last year's Global Prison Trend actually had healthcare in prisons as a special focus. So I invite you all to go back also to last year's Global Prison Trends as you start downloading and reading this year's. A concern before coronavirus, which makes it even more concerning, obviously, now, and to look at the health aspects of COVID-19 in prisons, I'm delighted to give the floor to Dr. Carina Ferreira-Borges, who coordinates prison health at the World Health Organization Europe. Carina, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And good morning, good afternoon, good night to all the participants. And thank you for this invitation. I'm very pleased to be here and to be part of the launch of such excellent, timely and needed report. Thank you, Olivia, also for presenting in such short time the great contents from this report and highlighting many of the features which are extremely important and that for WHO have also been a matter of special action. So I was invited to speak about COVID and prisons, and I would like to start by saying that the participants before me highlighted some important aspects which are related to COVID pandemics, but not only. And I would like to say that, in fact, the world is on crisis. And this is a huge test of leadership that requires decisive, coordinated, and innovative actions from all and also to all. And this has been something that has been already mentioned by several UN agencies, and we were very happy to also participate in some of the UN calls, broader calls from UN agencies in this crisis of the COVID, calling for improved access to healthcare, but also to other types of measures, such as seeking for alternative measures for imprisonment. We have been also highlighting that COVID is an opportunity to look at many of the issues that agencies and PRI and other partners have been already highlighting for many years, such as overcrowding in prisons and the need to sort, to give a response to this situation. WHO has also published in 2018 a publication together with UNODC dedicated to drug use and to alternative measures for imprisonment and for diversion of people that are sentenced to prison due to their personal consumption of drugs. And this is an issue that unfortunately, as Olivia has mentioned, we see that despite of the calls that we have been making, we have a huge problem and people keep being incarcerated when there are other alternatives that should be considered and are not being considered. Some principles have been already highlighted, namely the fact that governments have a duty of care, and they are also accountable for any avoidable harm and impairments that might result from inadequate healthcare measures or prisons conditions. And this is a very important point. There is documented excess, we have already documented the excess prevalence of many infectious diseases inside prisons. And of course, these infectious diseases have negative impacts on the immune system and thus increase the susceptibility to COVID-19 infection. So COVID comes as I mentioned, highlighting some of the risks that we know are already there, but they are highlighted in a way where we can see the danger of not putting in place measures in the healthcare system in prisons that will help to be able to respond in an effective way to such an emergency crisis. But again, it's not just about COVID infection, it's about other infectious diseases and other conditions that people are subject when they are in prisons. We have been working together with other agencies, and we have also issued a particular guidance to coordinate the response to COVID-19 infection in prisons and in other places of detention. And we have recently, I think 2 weeks ago, released a publication on preparedness, prevention and control of COVID-19 in prisons and other places of detention. So this is available on our website, and it has been receiving a lot of visits and has been widely disseminated in use by several governments around the world. We are hoping that the various entities that have adopted, and several governments as well, that this can be a start also for needed changes in the system. And that they can be fully maximized and used to prevent people from getting infected, or to mitigate the consequences of the infection of COVID through COVID-19 inside prisons. We have also produced fact sheets which will be launched very soon. Fact sheets which are directed to people in prison and also to healthcare staff in prison. So on ways how to deal with the COVID infection and measures, preventive measures, and also some response measures. We are also working on a checklist, which of course is part of the guidance that we have provided. Having said this, I would like to again highlight the importance of the report, Olivia, and all of the team that worked on the Penal Reform International report on the trends in prisons. Because there are many measures which are related to the improvement of healthcare systems, which are well documented in your report, and which are extremely important, and where we see that more action is needed. You have mentioned the issue about the number of healthcare professionals which work in prisons, and the shortage of these human resources is well documented, and it is an issue for worry when we see that, if we have a government that is responsible for providing the health care and providing the same standards of care like as in the community, that you would not have enough health professionals capable of providing that care. So clearly something is wrong, and something is needed to be done, and more investment is needed. So the numbers also in terms of the investments and how these funds are being allocated to infrastructures instead of improving the healthcare system inside prisons is also a very important highlight from your report. And we are completely in the same, we agree that these are measures, these are important key aspects that need to be addressed by countries, and that there's a need to improve this area. I think that there are a lot of measures that the COVID-19 situation highlights. And again, they are also an opportunity to relook at the health systems and relook at not just human resources, but also to the type of care which is available. And as you mentioned also, we have different types of populations inside prisons, but we know that the prevalence of many diseases is very high when compared to the rest of the community, and therefore there needs to be more investment in this particular health system, and so that we can serve the populations. Finally, I would like to highlight some principles also which we highlighted when we launched the report for alternatives to imprisonment on drug use. So there are quite a lot of principles, and mainly those principles which are related to human rights and to the adherence to all safeguards which are imposed by the UN standards, such as the Mandela rules. are principles that need to be adhered to, and we call all the institutions, to all the governments to adhere to those principles and to put them in practice and respect them, most of it. Finally, again, you know, I would like to just say that we are extremely happy to be part of this launch because it is an opportunity to work together in a field where there is so much to be done. And we have started, we have been collaborating for some years, but we have been now also supported by several countries which have increased the funding to WHO so that we can also work in this area. And we are very grateful to Finland and to other governments that have been great support of the efforts to improve healthcare systems inside prisons. So thank you very much, and I will be participating in the panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Carina Ferrer-Brogus, and thanks to your incredible leadership at this time. You have quickly put out guidance for prison staff and for prison management. You have put out the document as WHO with the High Commissioner's Office to protect human rights of people in detention at time of coronavirus. And all of this is extremely helpful for people who are on the ground, for lawyers defending their clients at this time. And so really thank you for your leadership once again. We have been speaking about reducing the number of people in prisons as an answer to COVID-19. You have heard that in Global Prison Trends, we document that 124 countries today have rates of overcrowding that are above 120%. As we see it today, overcrowding puts people in prison at higher risk, obviously of coronavirus, but before coronavirus, overcrowding puts people's health at risk and their safety at risk. Non-custodial responses should not only be looked for as an answer to coronavirus and should not be a short-term answer. It shouldn't be that the normal is to bring people back to prison in as high numbers as we had before COVID-19. And COVID-19 happens to us in 2020, which happens to be very exactly 30 years after the adoption of the UN Standard Minimum Rules on the use of non-custodial measures, the Tokyo Rules. And this symbolic of the anniversary of this year should help us in the future in increasing the use of non-custodial measures. And to speak about that, it's a great honor to give the floor to Joel Hernandez Garcia, the President of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, dear friends and colleagues. On behalf of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, we are delighted to participate in the launching of the Global Prison Trend Report for this year. And we are very grateful to Penal Reform Institute and the Thailand Institute of Justice for producing this report and for inviting us to share with you the experience in the Americas. And as it has already been said, one of the biggest challenges that the Americans have faced for many years is the problem of pretrial detention. On the other side, we also are facing enormous challenges in order to move states to adopt alternative measures to imprisonment. These are the two areas of our work during the years. And I have to say with very little success so far. The numbers are big. The report presents the global numbers, but they represent very much what is happening in the Americas, and our colleagues have already presented the basic information. Just to give you some figures in order to illustrate the size of the problem. The general average of people in pretrial detention is about 40% in our region, which is probably higher than the global average of people in pretrial detention in the world. However, that is only the average, because in some countries, the number of people in pretrial detention is really very worrisome. In Bolivia, for instance, 83% of the detainees are in pretrial detention. In Paraguay, 72.5%. In Haiti, 71%. And in Venezuela, 67%. Just to give you the 5 countries with the highest number of people in pretrial detention. And this runs against the principle of presumption of innocence. It's a gross violation of a fundamental human right. So what has the Commission been promoting? I can explain the work of the Commission in 2 areas. First, we have to work in order to correct the excessive use of pretrial detention. And second, we have to promote alternatives to detention. And we are facing challenges in order to promote these 2 goals. Let me go a little bit in detail. With regard to the eradication of the excessive use of pretrial detention, the Commission has promoted the standards on which pretrial detention must be applied. Basically, pretrial detention must follow 4 principles: exceptionality, legality, necessity, proportionality, and reasonableness. All these 4 would mean that a person would be put in prison just as a way of an exception. The pretrial detention cannot amount to the penalty itself when someone has not been trialed and therefore put in prison. At the same time, there must be legitimate grounds for pretrial detention, which are based on 2 principles: danger of flight and the risk of obstruction of justice. These are, for the Inter-American Commission, the only 2 conditions where the detention is legitimate. Now, we also have been working with member states of the Organization of American States to guarantee the independence of judicial officers, which is a key component in order to make the principle of presumption of innocence possible. We also have been working with the strengthening of public defenders, because those are, in our countries, the attorneys who represent prisoners in order to seek for alternative measures. As it happens over the world, inmates suffer of poverty and they cannot afford a private lawyer. So it is very important to strengthening public defender services. Now, as far as the second point, the alternatives to pretrial detention. For the Commission, alternative measures are considered measures of options of a procedural nature that allow the accused to be in freedom during criminal proceedings. And the following are examples of alternative measures. 1, a promise to submit to the proceedings and not to obstruct the investigation made by the prisoner before a judicial authority. Second, a second measure should be periodic presentation before a judicial authority or a designated authority. That is also in place in some countries where people are released on bail and under the obligation to make periodic presentations. Third, the subjection to the care or supervision of a given person or institution. Fourth, the prohibition on leaving a given area without authorization. That in many cases include the retention of passports in order to avoid the fight of inmates. The fifth, immediate separation from domicile in cases of domestic violence. And this is an important measure, especially in time of COVID-19, because another problem that has been arising within the pandemic is in an increased level of gender violence. So the countries must also look for ways of putting someone out of prison, but also in a different domicile in case where there was domestic violence. Another alternative measure is a bail bond, house arrest, which is also recommended, electronic monitoring mechanisms in criminal matters, restorative justice programs, and measures to expedite proceedings. The focus of the region has been on the more intensive use of electronic monitoring mechanism. However, there are advantages and disadvantages of this measure. One that has limited the use of electronic monitoring is the cost of such devices, especially in those countries where the cost has to be paid by the inmate. As far as the measures to expedite proceedings, that also has been brought with the presentation of the Assistant Secretary General. It's very important that in terms of pandemia, prisoners have the right to access justice. And in some of these situations, to adopt also measures to expedite proceedings. There is a large experience in that in the region, in the countries that we've been working with. For instance, Bolivia has implemented a system of judicial visits to the prison in order to expedite those prisoners in place. Another good practice that we have observed in the region is that established in Brazil, which they have implemented a system of custodial hearings. So detainees are brought before a judge even before the detention order is issued in order to confirm the viability of pretrial detention. Now, there are challenges, big challenges, in order to achieve these two goals. First, the list of incarcerable crimes in criminal codes has increased in the region, and instead of reducing the number of crimes who required pretrial detention, on the contrary, we have observed an increase of those incarcerable crimes. And this has had as a result, of course, the increase in the pretrial detention numbers that I explained before. Second, we have also observed in some circumstances the political use of pretrial detention. Just to give you an example, Nicaragua, in the Code of Criminal Procedure of Nicaragua, Article 173, Section C, provides for the detention in cases of actions against constitutional order. And there is no such a crime as acts of constitutional order in the criminal code. So during the social protest, which started 2 years ago, around 800 people were put in pretrial detention, just a measure of repression and retaliation against people who participated in social protests.
President Hernandez Garcia, I'll need you to conclude.
Yes.
Thank
Finally, and two other challenges that we have facing are disciplinary actions against judges who issue pretrial, who issue alternative measures. And finally, the role of the media. It's very important for the media to transmit accurate messages on the extent of pretrial detention and the use of alternative measures. I conclude with that.
Well, thank you very much, dear President Hernandez Garcia, and thank you for joining us for the launch of Global Prison Trends, which at its core has alternatives. I would also like to point at the Inter-American Commission's Resolution 1/2020, which was just adopted and gives a guidance on how to respect and protect human rights in times of COVID-19, and especially I would of course steer to paragraphs 45 and to 48 on people deprived of their liberty, where you're also calling on alternatives to custodial measures to be rapidly introduced by countries in Latin America. So thank you very much. Before giving the floor to Professor Dirk van Zyl-Smit, a reminder that you can put questions through the hashtag Global Prison Trends on Twitter. We already have a few, and we'll have a bit of time after the two next presentations to look into the questions that come. Professor Dirk van Zyl-Smit, it is a great honor to give you the floor to talk about people who are serving very long sentences and also lifelong sentences. Such individuals are often considered as most at risk by prison management and more susceptible than to end up in confinement, and especially in times of crisis to be put on confinement then, which can be very lengthy, as we now see with COVID-19, and can go on at this time. I have to say that it is a pleasure to have you. You're the head of the law school of the University of Nottingham, but you also happen to be the chairperson of Penal Reform International. So Dirk, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Florian. And before I start, I want to thank not only Florian, but all his colleagues, Olivia and others at Penal Reform International for this report. As chair of Penal Reform International, Florian mentioned, it's wonderful for me that we have such a dedicated body of people who work there and can produce a report of this kind. I'm also particularly pleased that you have dealt extensively in your report with life imprisonment. This is a topic which has preoccupied me, my colleague Catherine Appleton, for a number of years, and it really forms a contrast to what Dr. Hernandez Garcia said a moment ago, because here you are dealing with the very worst offenders, and you're asking questions, tough questions. What do you do with people of that kind, particularly in the current climate? So let me start by telling you a brief story which emerges from the newspapers in Scotland. On the 10th of April, the Scottish Sun, probably not a newspaper which many people here read, had the following headline: "Serial sex beast John Angus becomes first Scottish prisoner to die of COVID-19. And it goes on in the story to tell you what an awful man, and we name people in this country John Angus was, that he had served previously an 11-year sentence for some serious sex offense, and subsequently he had been given something called, not a life sentence, but an order of lifelong restriction. I read this story and I started wondering, what was the background to Mr. John Angus? I couldn't find anything in any of the current newspapers, but I managed to go back and look at what his sentence entailed. And the story was that in 2010, he had committed a relatively minor sex offense, but in 2011, the court had imposed an order of lifelong restriction on Mr. Angus with a minimum period of 18 months. Mr. Angus was never released, and 8 years later became the first person to die of the virus in prison. So in practice, whatever the intention may have been, and I'm sure I'm not suggesting that Mr. Angus was a nice man, whatever the intention may have been, the practical effect was that he was set, that as a result of his sentence, he died in prison. And I think that's something we should bear in mind when we think of these very long sentences and when we think of life sentences. I'm constantly struck in the study of life imprisonment about how many members of the public say, oh, well, they probably won't get out. They get out too quickly anyway. That is not the case if one studies this carefully. Many, many people who are sentenced to life imprisonment die in the arms of the state and are therefore in some ways, not in all, but in many ways, not that different from people sentenced to death. A sobering thought. The report reflects what essentially, Catherine, and my findings, that there are 479,000 people in the world serving life in prison. Ladies and gentlemen, there are probably more than that. I would say over 500,000, because the case I've just described to you does not appear in the statistics of life in prison. It's something else. It is an indeterminate sentence. And I'm sure the judge who imposed it thought, oh, well, 18 months minimum period probably means you'll be out after 2 or 3 years. Well, he wasn't, and he died in prison. When we look at reducing prison numbers, one thing to look at, and of course it's a very good thing to look at, is pre-trial detention, short-term sentences of that kind. But in fact, the biggest growth in the world is in longer sentences. And there's massive growth in sentences of life in prison. So what should we be doing about this? Well, firstly, we should not have mandatory life sentences. Secondly, when we do have life sentences, we should set shorter minimum periods. Thirdly, when we have people in prison for life, we should treat them as well as other prisoners. We should give them opportunities for rehabilitation. And fourthly, the toughest of all, we should be prepared to release them in appropriate cases. It's not always possible to do so, but in many, many cases it is. It's always a judgment on release, and it becomes particularly important when we know in the current circumstances that people who are in prison with life or very long sentences are at a heightened risk of dying. There are alternatives. They have to be thought about carefully. They have to be applied rationally and proportionally. That is my simple message from this area. If you want to find out more about it, and this is a little plug for Penal Reform International again, they've produced a marvelous policy paper on life imprisonment in many of the United Nations languages. Click on their website and have a look at it. But if I can leave one message, think carefully also of long sentences. If you were to try and reduce your prison population and you were to release thousands of people serving short sentences, good idea. But reducing sentences that are long makes more of a difference. I often illustrate it like this. When I worked in South Africa, I noticed at one stage that the average sentence for robbery had gone up from 8 years to 15 years. And I said to myself, well, what would the purpose of that be? Is the robber going to say, well, I'm going to commit this robbery, and if I get 8 years, it doesn't matter. And then the next week, when it comes out 15 years is now the average, it's going to say, well, 15 years is too much of a risk. It doesn't work like that. Long sentences are sometimes necessary, but excessive sentences are bad, inhumane, and a waste of money, if that's the sort of thing. So that is what I get from this report. Thank you very much for including the information that you have, and I look forward to more discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dirk. And Dirk is obviously a leading legal expert on on life sentences and very long sentences, but not only. And we thank you very much for having brought up this topic and paid attention to it. And I do want to underline that in Global Prison Trends, one of the facts that caught my eye yesterday as I was reading it is that an estimate for the United States of America, where sentences have had a tendency to become longer and longer over the last 3 decades, an estimate is that in 2030, 1/3 of the prison population of the USA will be over 55 of age. And we have just recently been in Texas, and this culmination between very long sentences, people with underlying health issues, and people growing old in prison, to me, is something that will present major risks when it comes to protecting health and continuity of healthcare in prison, and with prisons transforming into health institutions for elderly people. So Dirk, thank you very much for underlining this issue, and it links very well with the whole question about safety and security in prisons. We so often hear from prison management that people who have the worst of the worst are the most dangerous in prison, so they have to be in confinement. We see solitary confinement for ages in the United States of America of people who are on lifelong sentences, yet there is a question whether that actually provides any safety and security in prison. And at the time of COVID, we have seen the explosive riots happening in countries where we would have not imagined prison riots leading to death, typically in Italy, due to prisoners feeling that they are on lockdown and that they will be forgotten. The use of torture and ill treatment we show in Global Prison Trend, it remains a concern and is sometimes in some countries even systematic. To talk about all of these aspects, I would now like to give the floor to the Executive Director of the Justice Project Pakistan, Sarah Belal. Sarah, the floor is yours. Sarah, I think we cannot hear you. I don't know if it is. I will unmute you now, Sarah. Let's try this again. There you go. Sarah,
can you hear me now?
Okay. We can, yes.
Great. Blink twice if you can. No, I'm just kidding. Thank you so much for having me, and I want to congratulate PRI. All the way out in Pakistan, we look towards your guys' publications like the Word of God. It always arrives in time, and it is one of the most useful things that we use for our advocacy, and have been using it for years. So once again, this is incredibly timely, and thank you. I would like to talk a little bit about the issues that Florian has highlighted through the journey of the prison system in Pakistan and how it has dealt with the COVID outbreak. I very much agree with my previous panelists and how they've talked about that, COVID has kind of lifted the lid off of the existing systemic issues that were plaguing every country's prison system. And that is certainly the case for Pakistan as well. The state of prisons in Pakistan, some figures right off the bat. Pakistan is one of the largest reported death row populations in the world. It fluctuates between 4,000 to 8,000 people. The most recent tally of it is about 4,225 people. Almost every 7th person sentenced to death in the world is a Pakistani. Last year alone, over 500 people were sentenced to death in Pakistan. Keep in mind that the rate of overturning these sentences by the Supreme Court is also above 70%. So you can imagine just the amount of people that are being sentenced to death. Pakistan also has over 33 crimes that merit the death penalty, most of them which do not meet the international standard for the most serious crime. Pakistani prisons were overcrowded by 117%. Our capacity for prisons is 63,000 people, but we have 74,118 prisoners currently. In Punjab, which is the most populous province and has by far the biggest prison population in Pakistan, we were seeing an average of between the 1st and 20th of March or the 23rd of March, official figures showed that Punjab prisons was intaking an average of 467 people per day into their prisons. So the churn of people coming in and out of Punjab prisons is very, very big. And that presents its own challenges in terms of managing COVID and other infectious diseases in prison. If we look at the prison population in Pakistan and then we break it down according to the Federal Ombudsman and a bunch of other stats released by the government of Pakistan, they calculate elderly prisoners, which is over the age of 55, to be at least 1,500. These figures, again, fluctuate a lot. So these figures are based on something that was released last year. And I think that new figures haven't been released, but I suspect that this number has gone up. Out of those prisoners suffering from chronic diseases such as tuberculosis, HIV, hepatitis, have been calculated to be around 4,600. Mentally ill, they're saying diagnosed severely mentally ill prisoners are about 600. This figure, I can tell you from my own experience, is grossly underestimated because there's a lack of mental health services and understanding about mental illnesses. So many prisoners go undiagnosed. And juveniles, they're saying is about 163. The legal framework that looks over prisons and prison administration in Pakistan is the Prisons Act, which is in the 19th century, so it's 1894, and the prison rules that are formed under the act, which were last overhauled in 1978. In several prisons in Punjab, in Pakistan now, they've started revamping the prison rules. Punjab, so far, which is the largest province, has not done so, but there is movement to do that on the provincial level. So in comes in COVID in March in Pakistan. The 26th of February was the first case for COVID in Pakistan. We're now at 10,000 cases. Again, I think this figure is grossly underestimated because we don't have enough testing facilities. The first case that popped up in prison was on the 23rd of March, so nearly a month later than the first national case. That on the 23rd of March, and to date now, we are looking at 98 confirmed cases of COVID in prisons. 97 of them are in Punjab prisons and only 1 in Quetta. We again find that to be not accurate entirely because of the lack of testing available in other provinces and the lack of resources generally. Now, what's interesting is that, like all the other panelists have noted, COVID has presented an opportunity to speed up any kind of criminal justice reforms when we deal with the Punjab and the provincial governments as well as the federal government in talking about overcrowding and the need to reform our criminal justice system through the lens of looking at death row defendants and them being the most desperate and the ones the most in need. What we end up seeing is that it will take you years and no political will whatsoever. Because as we all know intrinsically that criminal justice and prisons are inherently a political tool. So there needs to be a fair amount of political will in order to achieve those things. But COVID has presented this incredible opportunity where we see some of the world's most incarceral regimes opening their gates and letting loose people because of the need to. And by no means are these regimes in any way, shape or form have been politically inclined to reduce these rates. But the threat of COVID has been such that they understand this basic principle, which I think for us as activists would have taken, I'm 40 now, I would have been doing this for another 40 years, which is to convince them about how public health and health in prison is prison health is public health. Suddenly it seems like we're preaching to the choir. In Pakistan, unfortunately, and this is the reason why I love my country, but it can be exasperating and demoralizing, is that we always tend to go the other way. So for the first time, I think Pakistan and the executive, as well as the high courts, the provincial high courts, were ahead of the curve in February in actually proactively dealing with prisoner releases and coming up with plans on a provincial level on releasing prisoners and using a bunch of mechanisms to release prisoners, such as the provincial government granting amnesty, the provincial prisons departments, you know, looking at releasing under trial prisoners. You know, they were looking at everything that was going on in the world, and they were going to be ahead in the measures that they were taking. And unfortunately, we had an intervention by the Supreme Court. Our Supreme Court has wide powers to take notice of any case without an actual application. They have wide suo motu powers. And the Supreme Court read the steps that were being taken by the executive and by the high courts in a very negative light, and put a stop to all of that. So we've now gone back to the drawing board and dealing with convincing our provincial governments as well as our provincial high courts to work within the framework, but nevertheless to look at the wave of what is happening around the world and in our region. We are looking at it. We stand right between Iran, India, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Nepal, and all of those countries have used many mechanisms to reduce their population. And we firmly believe that despite the setback, Pakistan will come to its senses, and the provincial governments will actually innovate and reduce their prison population, because there is, despite the best efforts that are continuing, there are people, there's just no way that we have the capacity to manage with the number of people that we have in our prisons. And neither do we have the resources to manage. To give you an idea, you know, in Punjab alone before COVID, 108 vacant posts for medical officers, which is usually one in each prison. So you had 108 vacant posts. You had 10% of Punjab prisons did not have ambulances. And the rate of tuberculosis, like I said, and hepatitis is just rampant. So you're looking at a population that is already extremely vulnerable to surviving, to dying under an infectious disease like COVID. What can we do, and what do I ask the esteemed panelists that are here today, who are, you know, some of my mentors and my heroes? The WHO guidelines were an absolute godsend for us. They came at a very important time, and we used them. I think we spend more money on printing them than we did on travel or anything else. All the money that we saved up from working from home, we spent on printing those guidelines. So my humble request would be, can we make them shorter and much more direct in what we're asking for? Because, and I'm happy to hear about the checklist, because unfortunately with all the advocacy that we do, whether it's the courts or the prisons or the politicians or the provincial governments, they don't like reading that much, and they like shorter stuff. So an abridged version of the guidelines with lots of pictures would be very helpful in doing advocacy on the ground, because we rely on them, absolutely. And we very much look forward to your checklist. The other thing that I had going was, I love Dr. Dirk's point about the longer term people. So we've been reduced at Justice Project Pakistan to advocating in a purely utilitarian manner with the provincial government, saying, if you do not empty out your over 60% rate of people in under trial prisoners, how on earth are you going to keep your dangerous criminals, or the ones that you really want to keep in prison? And, you know, by that we mean people on death row, the people that we have spent a lifetime defending, and people who are in for, you know, longer term sentences. You need to keep, you know, you need to empty out the under trials in order for you to create that space. But in order for us to speak to these, to advocate on this behalf, there is a dire need for collating all of this evolving data that's coming out. And collating, I mean, we do that at Justice Project Pakistan. We've created a global tracker, and there's been a lot of, for COVID and outbreak of COVID in prisons, and a lot of other international organizations have partnered together to host it and to update it. But in terms of guidelines, and in terms of what we are seeing on how this disease is spreading in prison, and how it's impacting prisons, and how different countries are taking certain measures, it would be wonderful to get updated, more direct guidelines on that. So I know that with international organizations, it's much more complicated than a small NGO like us in Pakistan, but we need what you put out. And if there is even a possibility of a monthly update, because when it comes out from the WHO, or comes out from PRI, or comes out from the Inter-American Commission, just even looking at your regions and the mechanisms that have been used and successfully used and praised, it makes a huge difference to us in other countries out, you know, in the world like Pakistan, when we quote that to the court, or when we quote that to the provincial government, or when we show that to the prison authorities in our countries in an effort to get them to make better policy dealing with this. And
Sarah, I will need to cut you off.
I was pretty much done anyway. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Every time I hear you speaking, I'm left full of energy. So thank you for joining the panel. And my ambition is to take 15 more minutes and to try to address 5 questions which we have selected and aim to be complementary to what has been said already. What I will do is that I'll steer each question to one of the panelists, but please do feel free by raising your hand to jump in, or just by unmuting your mic to jump in. If we do it in 15 minutes, that does actually require everybody to have relatively short answers. So we'll try this. I for sure know what my last question will be, which will go to Karina Ferreira-Borges and will be very practical. So we leave with a very practical coronavirus-oriented question. But to start with, I would like to steer a question to Dirk van Zyl-Smit. This has just been touched upon by Sarah. It's a question that comes to us from a Twitter user called Siddharth from Delhi, India. And the question reads, I quote, "The pandemic has forced prison systems globally to rush for immediate releases owing to overcrowding. However, immediate releases of accused and convicts also threatens the safety of victims of crime. How can this be balanced?" I'll start with Dirk, and then if other panelists want to come in, please do feel free.
Okay, a tough question. And it relates neatly to my topic, because India is unique in having more than 50% of its sentenced prisoners serving life term. The reason for that, I suspect, and this combines everybody's themes in a way, is that they have very long periods which people serve as what in India are known as under trials, and therefore many prisoners actually complete their sentences before they are tried. However, people who get life sentences do not complete their sentences before they're tried. So the answer to your question is there isn't an easy answer, but it does require, and it requires human judgment. It requires human judgment and humane judgment, firstly from judges, and secondly, depending on your system, from parole boards of one kind or another. It requires these people to have the confidence to make these decisions. And sadly, and as we know in the time of the virus, we have to make desperate decisions. Some of these will be wrong. But the risk is higher to human life of keeping masses overcrowded in prison. And the final thing that it requires is it requires also thinking what happens to these people once they're released. I'm very conscious, even in the United Kingdom where I now live, that if we had a mass prison release, there would be more people living on the streets, perhaps. Because do we have sufficient resources to look after them? So the answer is probably yes, try and release more prisoners, at the same time spend more money on helping those people after they release. You will find it is still cheaper than keeping them in prison. But there's no magic solution. That's the best I can offer.
Well, thank you very much, Dirk. I saw Sarah wants to jump in, and then we'll go to a second question.
Mute me, I think.
There you go.
Oh, okay, wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Dirk, and you're absolutely right. I think especially in South Asia, the traditional understanding and experience of prisons has been long sentences, long under trials, and then, long time under trial, then long sentences. And in a lot of times, at least in Pakistan's case, overturning those sentences, after 20 years, after 18 years. But what we have not done in that time being is actually looked towards a proper parole and non-incarceral or midway incarceral options that have worked quite well around the world. And therefore, in our society, I think we have a very limited understanding of crime and punishment. You're either in jail or you're out free. And I'm hoping that the opportunity that this whole COVID crisis has provided in terms of criminal justice is that it's going to force countries that were slow on this end to actually develop those systems. In Punjab, we've had the Parole Act for a while, but that board has not been notified for years. And this might be the opportunity that that board actually gets notified. So I look forward to that. I think this is going to be the thing that changes it.
Thank you very much, Sarah. And Dr. Kittingpong has raised your hand, and you have even done it in the sophisticated way of using the raise your hand option that Zoom provides us, which makes my life very easy. Please, Dr. Kittingpong, you have the floor.
I just would like to add from what Sarah mentioned, because in our case in Thailand, we try to promote for the more parole in prison because of COVID. And at first, the public afraid of the same problem, that there may be putting society in danger. But what we're trying to do is to let them know that actually in the prisons, not all who deserve to be imprisonment were there. When they saw that the statistic there is that most of the prisoners were imprisoned because of very lenient sentence, very less than 5 years for more than 50%, or almost 20% is a pre-trial detention, or a lot of people are elderly people, and when we inform them about the profile of prison, and that even though they've been released early, there still be some social control or some mechanism that we can control them. I think it's an opportunity for us to explain this misunderstanding of prison to the public. I think it's very important to communicate to the public on information about what inside the prison and what is the real population, the profile of prison to the public at this time.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kittingpong. And it is almost as if you knew what the second question is, which relates very much to what you just mentioned. It comes to us from Harvey Slade on Twitter, who is asking, given that penal reform is often so very unpopular, and actually this question is directed at President Hernandez Garcia, given that prison reform is often so very unpopular, how important is the role of media in building public support and facilitating positive change, including at the time of crisis like coronavirus, which then could also, I could then also invite Karina as a second speaker to respond to this question. But first, President Garcia, to the role of media.
Thank you very much for that question. That was one of my last comments. And this has to do with the challenges that society has in order to go to alternative measures. Because there is a general understanding in society that a prison is part of any legal system, and that is a measure to provide a civil safety. So the media has a very important role in order to portray the accurate situation. The situation of prisons, the conditions of imprisonment, the challenges that prisons have now in light of the pandemic, and the basic human rights that prisoners enjoy, regardless of their legal situation. So the media has a responsibility to transmit the humanitarian view what prisons are challenging. It is important that the media keep objective and keep apart from any political debate, because usually questions relating to prisons are very much politicized, and sometimes the trend in the region, in the Americas, is to provide for public safety by increasing the number of people in prison and increasing the years of penalty. So this is an important responsibility for the media to make awareness on population and create conscience of the grave situation that prisons and prisoners are facing now.
In a time of pandemic like now, with a disease knocking at the doors of prisons around the globe, or even being in prisons in many countries, how are you using prisons as media as WHO? And maybe Karina, you'd like to respond to that.
Thank you. So we have been interacting with the media, especially in this occasion related to COVID, and we have been very active trying to take away some of the myths. I don't think that, as it was mentioned already, prisons is a setting. And we have been trying to, I think that is something that is also mentioned in your report, trying to change the concept that prisons are about just, security issues, but should be, in fact, about the opportunity for rehabilitation and for promotion of, healthy lifestyles. I think that every time that I talk about, prisons as a setting for health promotion, everybody just looks at me like, something completely, what is it that, WHO is talking about, because this is a very unhealthy setting. But still, as a message, it is extremely important to educate the media and to educate, the overall population that prisons ultimate aim are to rehabilitate the people that go there. Otherwise, we go back to some aspect that was already also mentioned, which is if the decision of the population is that people should be sentenced to death, then it should be very clear that they do not want people to have other types of sentences or other types of rehabilitative processes, and therefore they're just convicting everybody to death. I think that's one of the things that has been highlighted here, is that many of them die, and they were at the end clearly sentenced to death, because even if that was not the aim at the beginning, but that's what's happened. So yeah.
Thank you very much. The third question comes to us on Twitter still, from an organization called Prisoner Inside, good friends of PRI. And this will certainly go to all panelists. I will start though with Olivia Rope, and then turn to Dr. Kitikpong, because he has somehow touched upon it in his introduction. So the question of Prisoner Inside is that we have mentioned during this webinar that about 2% of the world prison population has been freed within a month due to the concerns of coronavirus. Now, how do we make it that promising measures taken over this month become sustainable after the end of the crisis? Difficult question, but that's certainly on all of our minds. So I'll start with Olivia, and then we'll go to Dr. Kitikpong, and I can imagine that others will want to intervene and to answer this question. Olivia.
Yeah, I think this is something that civil society is, it's at the forefront of all of our minds, and there's a lot of collaboration going on at the moment to discuss how to harness what's happened. Two points that certainly is not going to give the magic answer, but there have been a lot of commitments from governments to release people from prison, but I think a sort of cautious word around the data needs to be given, because not all of the commitments have been followed through. And it's kind of a typical example of where there's, a lot of talk, but they're not really walking the talk. So that would be the first thing that I would say. And then the second thing that I think will be important as we move to a post-COVID-19 world is looking at what happened when those releases took place, and it basically evidencing crime rates. We know from Global Prison Trends that, you know, we draw on a lot of different research, and we can see that the prison rates are going up and up and up, and the crime rates are not going up. They're not correlating to that. And so I think around coronavirus, it will be, you know, just talking about media and public perception, it will be very important for us to gather the evidence to say, you know, nothing major happened. There was no massive disaster. And so therefore, why can we not have a bigger discussion about longer term relief for prisons?
Thank you very much. And I know that President Hernandez Garcia, you have to leave. So I'll, if you would want to answer this question, or do we say goodbye? Goodbye. Well, thank you very much for joining us. And then Dr. Kitty Pang on the sustainability of the positive measures that we have been seeing over this month. And after that, I think we'll have to close the seminar soon.
We have been discussing about the non-custodial measures and alternative to imprisonment for a long time. I think this year marked the 30th anniversary of the Tokyo Rule, that we talk about the non-custodial measures. And even though we know about this framework, but the lack of political will, the distrust of the alternative measures, or the lack of capacity or resources have been the hindrance all along when we're talking about alternative imprisonment. So I think instead of just have a one-time release of prison because of the COVID-19 problem, I think probably it's about time that we have a chance to look seriously into the overcrowding problem and try to introduce the framework that already have. For this report, we have the pull-out section that I think very timely, that we talk about alternative imprisonment as an issue that should come in because we know that the world now have more population in prison is increasing every year. So I think with this framework, with this push of reform toward the alternative to imprisonment and the non-custodial measure, I think we could make this sustain.
Thank you very much. As much as I would like to do more of the conversation about how we can make sure that this crisis at the end has a positive effect for people who are in detention, many of the people who are joining us, or who have been joining us over the last hour and a half, are practitioners and on the very day-to-day trying to help their clients in detention, trying to be there for the people that they have their eyes on when they're prison staff. I would then hence like to have a very practical question to end this webinar to you, Dr. Karina Ferro-Borges. And this comes from a lawyer in Geneva, Guillermo Palumbo, who is asking whether you could outline the very minimal health measures that need to be taken in time of COVID-19 in all places of detention. So the very minimal health measures that need to be taken basically right now.
Thank you very much. So the minimum healthcare measures are linked to the protection, to the prevention and to the protection, which are needed to avoid, first of all, that we have outbreaks inside prisons. We have been in the guidelines that we have, in the guidance that we have issued, we have mentioned those important measures. So these are measures which are linked to triage and screening that needs to be available for everybody who is entering into prison, including staff, as well as visitors. And of course, being sure that you have enough equipment and enough resources, and we have a contingency plan in place, because once you have positive or suspected cases in prisons, you need to know how to deal with it. And this has huge implications in terms of the staff, in terms of the people in prison, and in terms of the measures which are needed, as well as coordination mechanisms in the community, so that you can provide the best care for the person who who might be positive for COVID and might need special care. Not everybody will need special care, we know that, but it is important that we have those mechanisms in place, and we know that it is very difficult in these types of setting to take someone out of the prison and bring them to, you know, in an ordinary situation to a hospital. So more in this pandemic times. The 5 moments for hand hygiene, I mean, it is really important also. And this is valid for everybody, I mean, for the visitors and for anyone inside the prison. So these are also important measures. I think that basically, so having the tests, I think that this is also something very important, testing the prisoners, people in prison, because we might have suspected cases, and we have already talked about the impact of, you know, isolating people. We need to isolate to protect others, but there need to be appropriate measures, and having tests is a quite important measure, because this will reduce the tendency to isolate people. Also, because we have overcrowded systems, you know, there are other measures that can be like clustering people that are suspected cases, clustering them in a special part of the prison, which could also be an important measure to be taken into consideration. So all these measures are outlined in the guidance. Just wanted to say that the checklist will provide a very summarized version of what are the main important measures that need to be in place, either for the prevention but also for the response. And they will be, you know, they are very short. As Sarah was mentioning, it is important to have very short lists of, you know, what is the essential. And we are also, we are putting in place a system to collect more information and evidence about the number of COVID infections inside prisons. So we are developing a minimum set of indicators that we would like to put in place and send to every country. So anyone is, you know, everybody's welcome to also collaborate with us, because we would like to pilot this minimum set of indicators and have better data inside prisons and what is happening. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karina Ferreira-Borges. Dirk Van Zyl-Smit, thank you also for joining us. Sarah Belal, thank you very much. Dr. Kitty Pong, it is always a pleasure to have you, and the Thailand Institute of Justice is such a good friend of PRI, and always happy to have you as co-publisher of Global Prison Trends. Olivia Rope, thank you very much. I want to end by saying that usually you choose a Swiss as a moderator because of punctuality. I now live in the UK, so I'm less and less punctual. Sorry for that. And I do invite you all to go on penalreform.org, download the 2020 Global Prison Trends, which has just been issued today. Thanks to all of you to joining to this panel. And as we all said, coronavirus is a crisis, but criminal justice systems were in crisis before, and this pandemic sheds light to what was happening in prisons that we have just overseen. And this was just the start of the conversation. We will be in this for long, and I hope, Sarah, you were saying in 40 years we will regroup and we will see that we were able to have safe societies with fair and effective criminal justice systems, with way less people in detention and alternatives in place, as Dr. Kitty Pong called for as a sustainable solution. So thank you all very much. Well, good morning for some of you, good afternoon and good evening for others of you. Thank you very much.